Good morning, everyone. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this committee. Today's meeting is public and live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels. Before we continue, I'd just like to remind everyone, particularly our presenters today who may not be familiar with our process, just to wait to be recognized by the chair before you speak. It just helps our audio-visual folks in the booth. I'm going to ask the members present to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Rogers, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Nuvik-Boot Lake.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Reed. I'm MLA for Great Slave here in Yellowknife.
Okay, thank you. And I think we've got one member online, Mr. Hawkins.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yellowknife Center, and it's always a pleasure to have our millions of subscribers zooming in to follow our presentation. It's very helpful and heartening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Today, as part of its study of the Northwest Territories Power Corporation's governance structure, we welcome David Brown, Executive Vice President of Governance Solutions Incorporated. Thank you for joining us. And I see there's someone else online there if they want to introduce themselves as well when you guys go forward with the presentation. And we'll do the full presentation and then we'll open it up to questions from MLAs after that. So the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, joining me today is our founder, president, CEO, Dr. Deborah Brown. Let's say hello, Deborah.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So a brief word about us and what the presentation is about today. We have a background in Crown Corporation governance. It dates back to the mid-1990s. Just in terms of context, in 1995, the Toronto Stock Exchange published a report by the Day Committee, which is called the Day Committee Report, and it's better known by its title, Where Were the Directors? And basically, it's a blueprint for reforming corporate governance in the private sector. And so after it was released, a half dozen chairs of the major Crown corporations nationally, federal crowns, approached the Conference Board of Canada and said, we need to get ahead of this in terms of what's Crown Corporation corporate governance going to look like as a result of this major revolution and reform in governance in the private sector. And so what they did is they engaged us, Deborah and my company, to basically put together a program for Crown corporations and to work out with them collaboratively and research-based what does corporate governance look like for Crown corporations and other public sector entities. And so we acted for several years as a secretariat of the Crown Corporation Governance Forum and undertook that research. And so that's where we came from. Probably one of our biggest accomplishments during that time was in 1996. We collaborated with Treasury Board Secretariat to publish guidelines for the corporate governance of Crown corporations. And then those federal guidelines published by Treasury Board Secretariat were picked up by various provinces and jurisdictions around the country and applied similarly to different jurisdictions, the federal government's being recognized as sort of the lead jurisdiction. So we were deeply involved in that. We were deeply involved in the first audit of the new reform corporate governance by the Office of the Auditor General in 1997. And we've been involved with Crown Corporation governance ever since. And so that's a little bit about our background. We do not have any specific knowledge of Northwest Territories power. So we won't be speaking to that. We will be speaking to generic Crown Corporation governance, some of the principles, roles, and best practices. So that's a little bit about us, about where we come from, and what we will be talking about, and what we won't be able to talk about. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So Crown corporations are unique entities. They blend public ownership with public policy objectives. And because they're a hybrid between those two things, they're created as corporations that are intended to operate at a certain arm's length from government, not full arm's length the way a private sector or not-for-profit sector corporation would, but at further arm's length than a government department or an agency or board would operate. So they're partway along this spectrum, if you will, between fully government, fully private sector. They're a mix. They serve vital interests. One of the first major Crown corporations in Canada was the Canadian National Railway, to build a railway across the country. And they're used as entities to get stuff done for the government. And there's two main kinds of Crown corporations: commercial Crown corporations. So they're there to blend the public policy objectives and commercial realities, running a business. And then there's also non-commercial, or sometimes they're called heritage crowns, that are there to undertake the work of government in terms of art galleries and museums and things like that, public policy objectives. So that's who they are. Let's take a look at the next slide. So each Crown corporation is governed by specific legislation. Unlike the private sector and the not-for-profit sector, who have corporation statutes, the Business Corporations Act and the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, each Crown has its own statute. Some of them are incorporated under umbrella statutes in a jurisdiction, but you need to look at the specific legislation that define its mandate. And even though there are parallels between business corporations, not-for-profit corporations, and Crown corporations, there's also some distinctives. Oversight comes from both government as a shareholder and central agencies like Treasury Board Secretariat, like legislative committees like this legislative committee, like Auditor General offices. And so that's a little bit about the overarching framework of how a Crown corporation fits in with regard to its authority and its accountability. So next slide, the boards of Crown corporations. So typically boards are appointed by governor in council, order in council, which is essentially cabinet making decisions about who's going to serve on boards. For commercial Crowns, there's in the reform model of governance, there's an expectation that a majority of board members be independent. And in some cases, that's 100%. In other cases, it's 60, 70, 80%. And what we mean by independent is not only are the board members not members of management, they're also not working for government full-time. They're not deputy ministers or ADMs. So you may have deputy ministers or ADMs on a Crown Corporation board, but usually in commercial Crowns that have adopted reform governance, they're a minority. The majority are members of the community, business people, community leaders, people with some background in that sector, some expertise that they can bring with regard to the industry. You're looking for a diverse set of skills and background, diversity in terms of gender and indigeneity and various other dimensions of diversity, and sometimes regional representation too. If the Crown is looking after a broad territory, then you may want to have board members drawn from the various regions. And a good governance practice is to separate the chair and the CEO. that's a good practice in all three sectors, but in Crowns in particular, they play two different roles. The chair typically plays a role in Crown corporations as being the liaison between the corporation and the elected side of government, ministers and MLAs, whereas the chair plays the role of being the liaison with the appointed side of government, deputy ministers, ADMs, other members of the public service, and those are intended to enhance both the independence of the Crown and its accountability. Let's have a look at the next slide. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So we like to say that 80% of governance is pretty well the same, sector to sector to sector, and that's what this slide is intended to represent. In all three sectors, including Crown corporations, the board is responsible for the governance of the corporation. That's a board responsibility. It's not a shareholder responsibility, even though they own 100% of the Crown. It's not government's responsibility to run the governance system of a Crown corporation. That's the board's responsibility. And nor is it management's responsibility, even though they're there every day and they're experts in what's going on in the industry and strategy and risk and opportunities. It's not their role to run governance. The board is responsible and reform governance, and the governance we've chosen to adopt across Canada in all three sectors. The board is responsible to run the governance system of the Crown Corporation. And what we mean by the governance system, it's a system by which the Crown Corporation is directed and controlled. And this slide represents the 5 levels of direction the board sets. And by using the word set, the board of a Crown Corporation approves the strategic direction, the performance and risk direction, the people direction, including making sure that there's a CEO in place and the performance management of the CEO, the policy direction. There's clear policies in place governing the line between board and management, and then what we call the 5th level resource direction, the budget, the allocation of financial resources, and then the 5 right-hand boxes represent control. Governance is the system by which the Crown Corporation is directed and controlled. And what we mean by control, it's an awkward word, it's an accounting word. What we mean by control is gaining reasonable assurance, the board being confident that the Crown Corporation is going in the direction that it approved in each of these 5 levels. So that means the Crown Corporation board is going to receive reports from management and some outside advisors like auditors in each of these 5 levels. At the bottom right-hand side of this slide, you have financial reports, and then as you move up, you're going to get reports on policies. We're going to do performance evaluation on the CEO and board. We're going to, at the second top level, get dashboards and scorecards and key performance indicators. And then ultimately, it's all going to get rolled up into an annual report with annual financial reports, and a report on how we're doing vis-a-vis our strategic plan. And all of this is to gain confidence at a board level that the Crown Corporation is clear on the direction it's headed and is going substantially in that direction. That's what we mean by governance. This is the 80% that's the same sector to sector to sector. If you were on a private sector board, you'd have the same responsibility for governance with these 5 steps in direction and 5 steps in control or confidence. So let's look at the next slide then. So to summarize, the role of a board in a Crown Corporation balances corporate success with delivering public value, protecting the public interest. And so the board's responsibility must ensure the Crown Corporation stays mission focused, what we just talked about in the last slide, the 80% of governance. This is the 20% of governance that's different in sector to sector to sector. The 20% of governance that is different is ensuring alignment with the public interest, making sure that public policy objectives are integrated into the strategic direction, the performance and risk direction, the people, the policy, the resource direction. And so the four main roles of the board, if you will, in a Crown corporation are strategic direction and performance oversight, risk management and internal controls, which is often delegated to an audit finance committee, CEO selection, evaluation, succession, which is a shared responsibility with the shareholder, with government, and then ensuring alignment of all those areas of governance with the public interest, adhering to sound governance and financial principles. Let's look at the next slide. Yeah. So transparency is key here when we think about accountability mechanisms. Crown corporations are held accountable through various mechanisms that involve both reporting and active governmental review. The government doesn't need to rely just on appointing board members. So sometimes there's an assumption made that the primary accountability mechanism from a Crown corporation to government is by appointing board members, because the government has that power. We can appoint, we can replace board members. And when there's a crisis or a scandal or a really big problem, the government may pull that trigger and decide to replace a board. But having said that, day to day, that's not really the primary accountability mechanism. That's more of a last resort. The primary accountability mechanisms are annual reports, corporate plans, appearances before parliamentary committees, internal and external audits, government reviews and directives. Some crowns have a written MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between the government and the Crown Corporation. All of those mechanisms are better than trying to hold a Crown accountable through its board. It's more effective and less dramatic and less extreme if we use these as the primary accountability mechanisms. They're more focused and reliable than replacing a board every time something goes wrong. Let's look at the next slide, which is what are some of the key principles we seek in effective Crown corporation governance. One is transparency and disclosure. What we mean by that is people looking into a Crown corporation from the outside are able to see enough about what's going on to make informed decisions about their engagement with that Crown corporation. Creditors, employees, clients, the government need to see clearly enough about what's going on inside the organization through transparent disclosures in order to make informed engagement decisions. Doesn't mean that everything is public, though. One of the reasons we establish Crown corporations as semi-autonomous entities is they need to be able to do some things that are confidential, that are not public, at least in the short run. Perhaps they will be long run, but in order to undertake commercially sensitive work, Crown corporations need to be able to redact or restrict access to information as long as there's a legitimate, compelling reason. And there's only two really legitimate, compelling reasons to restrict transparency. One, privacy. Privacy law trumps corporate law. And secondly, commercial sensitivity. If a Crown corporation's in negotiations or discussion or litigation or development of something that's commercially sensitive that could put it at a disadvantage in terms of the best interests of the corporation, if it was disclosed, then the corporation may delay or redact that disclosure. That's the first key governance principle. The second one is independence and integrity, and that is the capacity of the Crown Corporation to be able to function independently of both the management team and the government itself. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that balance in a moment. Stewardship and accountability. The Crown Corporation has stewardship over assets and interests that belong to the Crown, but the board are the trustees, the fiduciaries, the stewards of those assets and interests while they are on the board of the Crown Corporation. And commitment to public service values. So these governance principles guide the behavior of the board and help the boards of a Crown Corporation navigate the balance between public and corporate interests. Let's look at the next slide. Yeah. So I mentioned our work with Treasury Board Secretariat, and the head of that project in 1996, his name is Gary Sheehan. I remember having a good conversation with Gary about how to think of Crown corporations. And he said, you really need to be able to think of Crown corporations as, on the one hand, acknowledge these are 100% subsidiaries of government. So just like Toyota Canada is 100% owned by Toyota out of Japan, the board of Toyota Canada has to be sensitive to what Toyota in Japan wants to have done in terms of strategy, risk, opportunity. So while we seek to have independence and autonomy, we also need to realize there's this 600-pound gorilla sitting over our shoulder that is our 100% owner, our parent, if you will. And so every Crown Corporation board ought to be sensitive to the fact that we are a subsidiary and we should respect the aspirations and needs of government as the shareholder. On the other hand, not on the other hand. So Bob Nixon was one of the first members of our Crown Corporation Governance Forum as the chair of Atomic Energy Canada. And one of the things he said about Crown Corporation boards, I remember both these stories from 1996 when we were putting the guidelines together for Crown governance. What Bob Nixon said is, if you're going to agree to serve on the board of a Crown Corporation, recognize that you only have two powers. One is moral suasion, and the second is noisy resignation. And you can only use the second one once in your career. So be careful about when you're going to do that. And he's not wrong. Being on the board of a Crown Corporation, you don't have this levels of authority and autonomy that a private sector board or a not-for-profit board does. You have the same responsibilities. You have the same fiduciary duty. You have the same responsibility to act in the best interest of the corporation and to set direction and then ensure what we call control, confidence. But you don't have the same span of control. Moral suasion is a huge part of successful Crown Corporation governance, recognizing at any time the board can be replaced by government. The board serves at the pleasure of government. So what does that mean then in terms of what we're talking about here today? It means that a board needs to balance the listening to and responding to the interests of the shareholder and understanding there may be some different interests of the entity itself, commercial interests, client interests, dollars and cents, financial, operational interests. And we may need to kind of push back and say, hang on a second, government, we need to do things a little differently, or put a business plan together that looks a little different than you might otherwise expect if we just had a blank canvas in front of us. So we're balancing the notion of Crown Corporation autonomy with shareholder control. We're balancing business priorities, running a Crown Corporation as an effective business with political priorities of people in government, including MLAs and cabinet that seek to be reelected, and so they seek to voice the will of the people, of the public, and to pass that along to Crown corporations. There's a complex stakeholder environment. It's not easy governing a Crown corporation. You've got management who've got their own, ideas. You've got government, and government isn't just a homogeneous lump. There's all kinds of branches of government and different MLAs and cabinet and elected and appointed and deputies and ministers and people who are on the political staff of ministers. They all have voices. Another story to briefly tell you, this will be my last one, is John Grant, that's his name. John Grant had the experience of chairing boards in all three sectors. He chaired a big private sector board in a publicly traded company. He chaired huge charity board in the not-for-profit sector, Ducks Unlimited, and he also chaired one of the big Crown corporations, Canada Land's company. And he said the difference in a Crown corporation is in the private sector, you have thousands of shareholders, but they speak with one voice. In the public sector, in Crown corporations, you have one shareholder, but it speaks with many voices. There's no single voice of the shareholder that you can definitively take as a Crown chair or a Crown board and say, okay, this is the direction government wants me to take. Because government isn't a homogeneous single whole. It speaks with multiple voices. There's a complex stakeholder environment going on in a Crown. And so maintaining that independence, that ability of the board to think and act independently of any single interest group is central to effective governance, but it's really tough to do. It's a balancing act worthy of a great deal of perseverance. Okay, couple more slides in terms of best practices in governance. Yeah, let's go to, thank you. So what are some of the things you would expect to see in best practice governance in Crown corporations? You expect regular board evaluations, at least once a year. There'd be a formal evaluation of the effectiveness of the board and typically the chair as well. There'd be clear board mandate and charter. What's the board responsible for? What's its work plan? How is it going to accomplish its work during the course of the year? There would be professional development opportunities for board members, not just onboarding, but ongoing, continuing education in governance, in the relationship with the machinery of government, which is a black box to most people who serve on Crown boards. What the heck is this parliamentary committee, this legislative committee? What's cabinet's role? What's the premier's role? What about the appointed side of government? This notion of that John Grant said, single shareholder, multiple voices. And so professional development would extend to the industry too. If you were running a power company, you would want board members who don't have industry background to get significant education, training, development in the industry, technology, the risks and challenges that the industry is facing, a whole environmental scan for the industry. And you'd expect a strong ethical framework and conflict of interest policies. It may seem more clear what a conflict of interest looks like in the private or not-for-profit sector, but in the Crown corporation sector, there are all kinds of nuances when it comes to perceived conflict of interest. And what I'm talking about is a board member having affinity with a particular group, maybe even a community, Maybe it's a corporation, but as often as not, it's not. It's a community or some other entity, and being perceived to nudge the corporation in favor of the interests of that particular entity, that's potentially a conflict of interest. And so those gray area potential perceived conflicts of interest, you want to really be clear about disclosing those and deciding on how you're going to deal with them and minuting that, so that the Crown Corporation can feel confident that you have a strong ethical framework. And if you implement those best practices, then your governance processes should be effective, ethical, and compliant with both government and societal expectations. So the next slide is about evolving trends. We're going to see an increased emphasis on ESG, that is to say, the Crown Corporation's obligation to protect the environment, social justice, and good governance. Crown corporations are adapting to new governance realities. Those include digital transformation, cyber risk, technology, and even AI, artificial intelligence. How are those technological shifts affecting a corporation? And therefore, how do I integrate those when I set the strategic direction of the Crown Corporation? And we should expect to see greater transparency expectations from the public. There's a right to know, and that right to know is being, I would say, more diligently advocated for, both by government, like a committee like this, and broadly through media, through news reports and CBC and other news media on behalf of the public. And we should expect to see that's not going away. That these are trends. These are three trends that we're going to see continue and impact and impinge on Crown corporations and their governance. Okay, last slide. So I hope we've been able to give you a picture of Crown Corporation governance and how 80% of it is similar to governance in other sectors. 20% is quite different. It's unique, but essential in order for Crown corporations to succeed. Strong governance in Crowns ensure trust, performance, and public value, including protecting public interest. And all of this is dynamic. Crown corporations need to stay focused on continuous improvement and growth, continued vigilance, not making assumptions. The trust but verify, I think, is a way of putting part of that. Strong governance isn't just a regulatory requirement. We're not just doing it because we have to. We're doing it because it's fundamental. It's foundational to the Crown Corporation being able to succeed, to deliver public services and public value through the Crown Corporation. It's an essential ingredient in Crown Corporation success and effectiveness. All right, so that's the presentation itself. Deborah, do you have words you would like to add before we turn things over to our committee?
No, I think you've said it well. We'll just let them ask questions.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Chair, over to you.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'll turn it over to committee members. Does anyone have questions for the presenters? Mr. Rogers, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the overview and Crown Corp governance. Certainly appreciate that. In your experience, and I assume you've worked with several of these Crown corporations, have you seen it in a situation where the government would fill the board either for a temporary time or for a longer period of time with actual deputy ministers or government officials versus members of the public? I know there's always a portion on there that typically you'll have a DM or a government representative on a Crown Corp board, but usually the board, I think the makeup typically across the country is that it's made up of public interest reps. Have you seen it other jurisdictions, I guess, where that has happened, where they've actually put government officials on that board? Thanks.
Thank
Go
you
ahead,
for your
Mr. Ross.
question. Sorry, did you want me to go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, this happens quite often. As I mentioned, it's a last resort. If a government feels that the Crown Corporation is just not going in the direction that it needs it to go and is not listening to it, is too independent, has gone too far in that pendulum towards independence and away from the notion of being a subsidiary, then as a last resort, it always has the power to replace the board, and often the board will be replaced in the short term by people who work for government, deputy ministers, ADMs, so that the government can re-exert control and put in place a strategy and a CEO that will be more attuned and aligned with the public policy interests of the government. Sometimes it happens when government changes, not very often though. Usually governments are happy enough to inherit the boards of a crown, not usually a biggest priority changing them. But as you mentioned, this is typically a short-term measure. It's not something you want to have in place for year after year after year. After you've stabilized the situation and you've got a Crown Corporation, a CEO and a strategy that are aligned with the shareholder, with government, then typically you would step back and you would replace those inside board members with outside independent people with an objective of having them all really 100% independent down the road. Now, it might take a couple of years in order to stabilize, but yes, we see it all the time in hospital boards, in school boards, in boards of utilities, university, college, occasionally as a last resort. Yeah, we see it right across the broad public sector and Crown corporations. It's a last resort because it's really dislocating. It can send shudders down the spine of management, and you could lose some really good members of your management team because of the uncertainty. You can also have big public fights that can happen. In Manitoba, there was a huge sort of public fight dispute that broke out between members of the power utility board and government over a settlement that was being approved, and difference of opinion between government and the board members as to whether this should be approved. And so it's got some real downsides to it. But as a last resort, in order to restore the alignment between the shareholder and the Crown, we do see it happen. But the key is it's short term. It's not a long-term solution. Because think about the position you're putting those people in. You're asking an ADM or a deputy minister to wear two hats. I got my day job where I have to be loyal to government and do everything that the minister and cabinet and the government of the day seeks me to do. But also when I'm sitting on the board, I need to be a fiduciary. Corporate law requires me to act in the best interest of that corporation. So they're being torn in these two different directions. And so, yeah, it's not really tenable long term.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers, do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that answer.
Okay. Mr. Hawkins, I have you next online.
Thank you very much, and thank you to both the presenters. I think we trouble. It's easy when you mentioned an example of the CN. It's a national, entity, and in some ways, the bigger it is, maybe the easier it is to divest into a crown corporation and allow it to do its thing over the longer term, as opposed to the cycle of we'll call it an election cycle. Because of course election cycles require they demand it in the essence of every cycle demands these types of results, whatever flavor. So there's a lot of pressure of ebbs and flows. But in a small jurisdiction as we have, the challenge, of course, is the formula is exactly the same. But the challenge, of course, is you may not understand or appreciate is that you can't walk out the building without stumbling on someone you know. And hence, everyone wants to know what's happening in this crown corporation, or why aren't they doing this and why aren't they doing that? And it's very difficult when you're in a position of politics, whereas then there's an extraordinarily high expectation for instantaneous response. And of course, we all know response means what they want, not necessarily what we need. That said, by way of ever so brief example, recently we had multiple power outages, some longer than it has been years. I remember growing up, they were quite lengthy. We live in a time it's no longer reflective of the days of yore when power outages were common. But that said, when I'm hearing from businesses, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, and on, and why aren't you doing this? The challenge, of course, communicating this to a crown corporation is, here's the political problems. You need to respond, and they respond like a giant herd mentality, very slow, very process orientated, and they're not as nimble as we need them to be. And because of their independence, sure, but sometimes it's because of their independence is exactly why that. So to summarize, then we have, in the sense of, to give you a contradiction to that, is we have a department that calls itself a corporation. We call it Housing Corporation, where members are involved, but not directly. So, the balance of trying to get the ideals is very difficult. I appreciate the illustration you've given us, because if, for example, our Housing Corporation was a true crown corporation, we wouldn't be dealing with the minister. We get a hybrid. We don't deal with the budget, but we get to deal with the minister and complain that somebody doesn't have housing or something isn't working, and then we'll call it a departmental response. So I guess this kind of leads to where I'm really going, these type of challenges in very small jurisdictions, because again, we know everybody, like everyone on these things. When does it make sense that a crown corporation should revert to, for example, a department? Because its independence is really, really on paper, but its actual operations doesn't reflect that. So, can you think of an example that it sounds like a great ideal that, we're going to set up an independent crown corporation, we're going to launch them in a way that they can be independent, do things government can't be, they're nimble, they'll make independent decisions over a longer gaze. But maybe in small jurisdictions it doesn't necessarily always make sense to do that, and I'm thinking in particular one example, maybe two, but your thoughts on when to reverse it into a department so that it has departmental oversight. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So every few years, government should do a mandate review on a crown, and one of the questions it should ask is the crown corporation still the best vehicle to deliver these public services? I would say there's no natural death date of a crown corporation. I would say there's no natural need for it to ever revert. And revert's probably the wrong word, because they was established as a crown corporation in the first place. For it ever to come in-house as a government department, really has to do with, in my experience, the trade-off between public policy objectives and commercial objectives. Government line departments, agencies, boards are well equipped to deliver public policy objectives. They are not well equipped to deliver commercial objectives. And therefore, as long as the particular opportunity, business, whatever you want to call it, continues to have a mix of public policy objectives, we want to deliver power to the farthest reaches of the territory, the land, and the jurisdiction, let's call it that, and commercial, and that is to say we need to find a way to generate enough revenue to pay our costs. We need to be efficient in how we run this. We need to look at expenses and all the rest of it. As long as those two things continue to occur as imperatives of the strategy of the corporation, I would not see it ever reverting. And I guess, revert is, I would never see it not being a crown corporation, regardless of the size of the jurisdiction. I acknowledge the size of the jurisdiction makes it more difficult. If you think about Saskatchewan, it's got the biggest crown sector in Canada, and yet everybody knows everybody really in Regina and Saskatoon, and the people who sit on the board of SaskPower and SaskTel and SGI, they're known broadly in the business community and among community leaders throughout the province, but they're chosen among people who have character that have the capacity to manage that. Their character has the capacity to be able to handle the sort of running into someone at the co-op and they're going to ask you a bunch of tough questions. And a lot of the time you go, hey, I can't talk about that. That's something that's inside the board. Here's what I can talk about. And so there's mechanisms in smaller jurisdictions to give board members talking points so that they can handle those inevitable questions from people that know them. And that's preferable to bringing the Crown Corporation inside government. It is really difficult to run a business inside government. I'm not saying it's impossible, but there's a reason why even in tiny jurisdictions, we still see a robust Crown Corporation sector. That sector exists where there's needed goods and services that are not being delivered by the private sector. They're essential services. They have to be delivered by the public sector, but we also have to do it through the lens of an effective commercial business with a board. And that board ought to be a business independent board. So, yeah, you would look at mandate. That's the questions you would ask. How might we? And how might we, if we've decided to leave the entity as a Crown Corporation, arm's length, how might we help the board and management and staff handle those questions in a small community? That's the way I would approach it. Deborah, I see you're nodding. Did you want to add to that?
I am not. I mean, it all comes back to purpose and mandate, and it's not just the board members who face people at the co-op. It's the MLAs and it's people in government, and so I think that has to be. They need to be that expectation or the expectation of a response is there, and so it is a challenge. I acknowledge that that's a challenge, and it's one of the trends in governance. It's only going to increase. So I don't know that that's going to go away, but I don't. You want to say, what problem are we trying to solve? And I think if you try and solve that problem by just bringing a business entity into government, you're probably trying to solve the wrong problem.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Robert, do you have a follow-up?
No, I think we all struggle with this challenge, again, it being a small jurisdiction, and I was more thinking about the reverting in and I didn't go at length, our housing corporation, where it acts, it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, but calls it itself a corporation by no other name. But I think that you did provide some interesting comment, you provide lots of interesting comments, but one particular one I want to emphasize is that it's good that you put that comment around, or framed it around, there's no natural death date. And it sounds cruel or morbid, but I'm okay with that. I say worse all the time. But it is a good point, which is followed by the next point, which was a regular review of their mandate. Are they meeting their objectives? And I think that that's really the compounding question that keeps getting involved is what is the mandate? And that's referred to governance too, not just, of course, the outcome of what see, and that's the problem. We call housing a department all the time. And like I say, it acts like a duck and walks like a duck, but yet it has the framework. So I think that's something I'll take from the last point, which is maybe we should be talking seriously about its regular review of its mandate, whether regular means 5 years, 4 years, etc. But to allow it to have that type of, we'll call it inner reflection, as well as its objectives. So thank you very much for that. No particular question, but I'll just say I thought at least that's worth grabbing onto as a reminder. Are we balancing political objectives versus commercial objectives, and are we getting involved? And should we be involved? Thank you.
Mr. Brown, do you want to respond to that? It wasn't really a question, but you're welcome to if you'd like.
Well, just briefly on that death thing, we think about corporations as people under the law. They're considered individual people under the law. And so sometimes it can be helpful to think about them having a birth, having a life, having a purpose, a calling, and running into illnesses and diseases, and having good days and bad days, and ultimately, in some cases, having a natural death. And in the private sector, that happens all the time with wind-ups and mergers and acquisitions. So yeah, we don't really mean to be morbid. It's just a way of thinking about a corporation as an individual, as a person under the law, and the board as the directing mind of that body corporate. You're the one who decides what happens with the life. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any further questions from committee members for the presenters? I'm not seeing anything on the floor. Mr. Hawkins, did you have anything else? It didn't sound like it, but just want to check in.
No, I think I have enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll throw a couple questions out there myself. My first one was just, you emphasized the need for regular evaluations, and I'm curious, what does an effective evaluation look like to you? I mean, I think I'm familiar with some of the tools like annual reports, things like that, but yeah, can you maybe give us an example of best practices of evaluation of board performance, evaluation of Crown Corp performance? How does that take place in the best scenarios? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a tough one. There's no single right answer to this. It really does. There's a lot of different methodologies for evaluating the effectiveness of Crown corporations and boards. At one end of the spectrum, you could do a brief annual self-assessment survey. After you've had a meeting, you have a survey, it's online, you get the results, the chair shares them, you have a discussion. At the other end of the spectrum is you have a full mandate and governance review, where government opens up the act and an outside party comes in, and every single part of the governance of the Crown is opened up to a detailed review. And then along that spectrum, you have a number of different places. Typically, for a commercial Crown corporation, once a year, it usually just before your new board members are appointed, if you have regular terms. Some Crown corporations don't, but if you have, what you want to do is, once a year, you would do a formal evaluation of the effectiveness of the board. That would typically include a fairly detailed self-assessment questionnaire. It probably would include other steps like interviews or observations. Best practices, it would be conducted by a third party, an independent third party, so that it's not just circular. Because in some cases, boards can be so self-congratulatory that a self-assessment evaluation is of no real value. So the key is to bring an outside third party and then to scale the evaluation each year, potentially to even add and subtract different methodologies and different tools so that you're getting what you need, something fresh every year, something forward-looking. It shouldn't be backward-looking or blame. It's about how might we enhance the effectiveness of the board and the effectiveness of the Crown. And then those third parties ought to be able to share with you tools like scorecards and dashboards and things like that will help the board monitor and evaluate the performance of the Crown throughout the year, not just at this annual formal performance evaluation. That's a little bit about it. I mean, there's a lot we could. Deborah, I see you unmuted.
It goes right back to the question about mandate. You really want to know what's your purpose. Why are you doing the evaluation? You do want to do something annually, but you want to know why you're doing it. What's the purpose? Because that will drive the how. And there's all kinds of different mechanisms that people like us use all the time in order to decide how to best do it for this particular board at this particular place in its journey. And then how might you monitor that over time to ensure that the board and its effectiveness is continuing and growing and improving over time. And you'd want to use peer benchmarks if you have them. It's something that we do. But yeah, what's the why? That will drive the how, and you want to monitor it over time and look for growth and patterns.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The other question I wanted to ask is, to give a little bit of context, our Power Corp, and members have kind of alluded to it a bit, was, the public board was disbanded, replaced with deputy ministers, and they have just recently issued a call for reestablishing the public boards, and so there's a call for applications out right now. But do you have any examples you've run across of successful renewals of an organization that's been through a process like this? I mean, I'm sure you've seen all sorts of different things in your career, but if you have any ideas of a good case study to look at where, an organization was struggling, brought under government control and then put back under public control, I'm positive that that's probably happened before. Do you have any examples of where that was done really successfully?
Good question. Well, it's not a Crown corporation, but here in Ontario, the Ontario College of Teachers, the government appointed a sort of like a trustee called a supervisory officer to replace the board. And then after a transition period, a new board was brought in with a whole different set of expectations around their competencies and how they're going to be selected. So that's an example of a really successful example of a board basically voting itself out of office. It agreed to sort of step aside and have the government appoint the trustee and then put a new board in place. I'm thinking about Crowns. Hospital boards, we've seen it happen successfully in a number of different hospitals. I think the Kingston General Hospital may be one example, probably talking quite a few years ago. You're probably looking for something closer to home in terms of a commercial Crown corporation. Doesn't happen very often in commercial Crown corporation. Yeah, I don't know, Deborah. I don't know if that's what happened there or not. Can we get back to you on that? Are we able to do that?
Yeah, of course you can, and we definitely appreciate it. With that, my last question is just, yeah, similar to that. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from you, in your opinion, kind of what are some of the best performing Crown corporations to look at, but in particular, what to look for. I'm curious to hear from you what you think is the best way to have, or the best example of a really good mandate or charter that a board operates under, and particularly, I mean, I'm thinking kind of tying it back to the evaluations that you've referred to as being important for performance. Is I would assume that some kind of performance indicators or measurement tools must be built into the mandate or the evaluation framework in some way, so people know what it is they're actually measuring the performance of. I mean, I think sometimes in government, performance is measured in the sense of how angry or happy is the public in any given moment, but surely there's better and more subjective tools to be used. I'm kind of curious to hear from you what kind of a good mandate looks like, and how it can be best used to hold a board accountable in the right ways. Thanks.
Yeah. So giving examples would be really tough, because, I mean, we have clients in the Crown sector that I think are really well governed, but I don't know if it would be appropriate to share their names with you in a public forum. Although I could. I think if you look at the major federal financial Crowns, the ones that report in through the Ministry of Finance, they're generally considered to be well governed. EDC, Business Development Canada, Farm Credit are the three that come to mind, what we call finance Crowns federally. Provincially, I mean, Saskatchewan's Crowns have a good reputation in terms of how they're governed. It's a different system there because there's an intermediary Crown Investments Corporation that acts as a holding company on behalf of government, which is intended to increase the independence of the boards of Crowns while protecting government's interests. But you wouldn't necessarily need that in order to follow the governance practices of a Sask Power and SGI or Sask Energy all come to mind as commercial Crowns that are generally considered to be well governed. Yeah, you're right in saying there ought to be a really well fleshed out board charter, mandate, terms of reference that you can then use as one of the inputs into your evaluation of effectiveness of a board. It's not the only one, because when you evaluate the effectiveness of a board, what you're looking at is, yes, what's in their mandate, charter, terms of reference. Are they doing their job? How well are they doing their job? But also governance in the organization. So it's going to be informed by both those inputs, your board charter and your governance system, including your strategic plan. How can a board be effective if the organization is not achieving its strategy and has a clear strategy? Those are a couple of things to think about. Deborah, how can you help with this?
I think a lot of the Crowns have their mandates or charters on their websites. I would look and see if Sask Power has theirs. I think that would be a helpful one to look at. I know we also have some things that we can share with you that are governance protocols, governance board mandates that are kind of samples that if you would find that helpful, we would be happy to share those with you, and you might find those of value. I think in terms of that whole evaluation piece, you do want to ensure that you're evaluating them against their charter so that you can keep it objective, that it's not so subjective. But you're also, as David said, you're going to want to look at how effective is the strategy going. And it's, I think, a big piece of the puzzle too is boardroom behavior and culture. And so we do a lot, and we see a lot of those aspects being evaluated as well, because you can have the world's best charter, the world's best board mandate, but if people aren't behaving in the boardroom, or they're not, their culture is not a healthy culture, then it's just paper. So you want to build those types of pieces into your evaluation system as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate those answers, and certainly I think committee would appreciate any of that follow-up information that you have to share. That would be helpful for us. So I'll throw it one last time out to committee if anyone has questions that'll come up for them during the presentation. I'm not seeing any hands raised, so with that, I will bring this presentation to a close. So I just wanted to thank you both for taking the time to present to us today. It was informative and helpful. Do you have any closing comments you wanted to share?
Yeah, I mean, I would just hearken back to what Bob Nixon cautioned. It's really tough governing a Crown corporation. There's a real art to it. It involves collaboration and openness and a little bit of grace too. So I guess that's probably where I would leave you.
Excellent. Oh.
Just thanks for having us. Reach out if there's anything you need, and we will follow up on these items and send them off to you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Hopefully it's been helpful.
Thank you very much, and on behalf of committee, we thank you for appearing. So for anyone tuned in, we'll be back on at 10:30 for another presentation, but for now, we'll close the public portion of this meeting. So thank you everyone for tuning in.